This image is probably one of the most famous in the history of art, and yet there is a detail in it that most people never notice. If you look closely, you'll realize that Adam's index finger is not fully extended toward God. It's slightly curled, as if Adam could reach God's finger, but chose not to, not entirely, and that detail, which might seem minor, is actually the key to understanding this entire painting. The creation of Adam was painted between 1508 and 1512 on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, as part of a monumental cycle of frescoes that Michelangelo completed under commission from Pope Julius II. The work covers more than 500 square meters and contains over 300 figures. It is, probably, the greatest individual pictorial achievement in the history of Western art. But of all the scenes Michelangelo painted on that ceiling, this is the one that has become most recognized around the world. The composition appears simple. On the left, Adam reclines on the earth. On the right, God is suspended in the heavens, surrounded by angels and wrapped in a great cloak that seems to move with the speed of his flight. Both stretch their arms toward each other, and both index fingers almost touch. To understand what Michelangelo painted here, we first need to understand what was happening in the world at that time. The Renaissance was a complete transformation in the way human beings understood themselves. For centuries, medieval theology had taught that man was essentially passive before God. He was seen as a dependent creature, shaped by divine will and destined to obey. Salvation was something you received, not something you sought. But in the 15th and early 16th centuries, that image began to change. Renaissance humanism placed the human being at the center of philosophical thought. Philosophers like Pico della Mirandola argued that man was the only creature in all of creation capable of defining himself and choosing his own destiny. Michelangelo was deeply immersed in that debate, and what he painted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel is not just a story drawn from the book of Genesis, it is also a statement about human nature. Now let's look at the painting carefully. God's body is convex, active, and propelled forward. Everything in his figure radiates energy, the cloak billowing with movement, the angels holding him up, the arms stretched out with force and determination, and his index finger is fully extended, reaching to the very limit of his reach. Adam, on the other hand, is concave and receptive. His body rests on the earth in a way that critics have described for centuries as almost drowsy. His right arm presses into the ground, supporting the weight of his body, and his left index finger points toward God, but not in the same way. If you look closely at this detail, Adam's finger is slightly curled, not fully extended, not fully closed, just slightly curled, and that small detail completely changes the interpretation of this painting. In this image, God has already created Adam. Genesis makes that clear. The man already exists, he already has form. What is about to happen here is not the creation of the body, but the transmission of something far deeper, the breath of life, the divine spark, consciousness itself. With that in mind, Michelangelo made a decision that no painter before him had made in quite this way. He depicted that moment not as a unilateral act of God, but as an encounter that requires two willing participants. God has reached the very limit of what he can offer. His finger is fully extended, but it is Adam who must decide whether to extend his, which means the space between the two fingers, those few centimeters that separate them, is not empty. It is where free will lives. Many of you might think this is a modern interpretation, but it is actually quite the opposite. This reading is backed by something that Renaissance artists and intellectuals debated openly. The idea that human beings, unlike any other creature, have the capacity to turn toward God or away from him, not out of necessity, but by choice. As I mentioned earlier, thinkers like Pico della Mirandola wrote in his Oration on the Dignity of Man that God told Adam he could descend into something no better than a beast, or rise until he approached the divine. That ambivalence, that radical freedom, was for Renaissance humanism the most extraordinary thing about the human condition. Michelangelo almost certainly knew that text, and it is very likely he had it in mind when he painted this work. Adam's curled finger should not be read as a sign of weakness. It is the mark of a being who has the capacity to choose. God has already done his part. He has stretched out his arm, crossed the heavens, and reached as far as he can reach. What happens next is up to man. But there is another element in this painting that reinforces this idea, and one that went almost unnoticed for centuries. But before I tell you about it, I'd like to remind you that if you would like to have this work in your collection, you can now purchase it from our website. In our catalogue, you will find more than 900 carefully selected historical works, so you can choose your favorites and start your own art collection. Shipping is free worldwide, and by purchasing from our store, you will not only receive a reproduction as faithful as possible to the original, but you will also be supporting me enormously in continuing to create videos like this every week. I'll leave the link in the description so you can place your order once you finish watching the video. Now, let's continue. In 1990, neurosurgeon Frank Meshberger published an article pointing out something remarkable. The cloak surrounding God and the angels has the exact shape of a human brain seen in sagittal cross-section. The outline of the cloak corresponds to the cerebral cortex. The lower left angle aligns with the brainstem, and even the figure hanging below the cloak like a green scarf reproduces the shape of the frontal lobe. It is well known that Michelangelo spent years dissecting cadavers to understand human anatomy. He was not exactly a stranger to the shape of the brain. If the form surrounding God is indeed a brain, then what God is transmitting to Adam could be interpreted as more than just physical life, intelligence, consciousness, the capacity to think, and therefore to choose. If that is the case, Adam's curled finger takes on an even more precise meaning. The fact that man already possesses the faculty of reason does not mean he has decided to use it to seek God. And so that moment of hesitation, that instant suspended between the gift and the choice, is what Michelangelo captured in this image without us ever realizing it. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this interpretation. Do you think Adam's curled finger was a deliberate choice by Michelangelo, or simply the natural posture of a body that cannot quite reach its creator? I'll be reading every comment. Thank you for your support, and I'll see you in the next video.